The alley reeked of stale beer and desperation. Under the sickly orange glow of a single flickering street lamp, George Hoover moved with a brutal, mesmerizing grace. His face, a canvas of sharp, handsome lines, was already marred by a fresh cut across his cheekbone, his lips split and bleeding. But his eyes, dark and focused, held no fear. A grunt of pain wasn't his as he twisted, using his attacker's momentum to send the man crashing into a brick wall. He sidestepped another lunge, his elbow connecting with a sickening crunch to the second man's jaw. They were clumsy, brutish. He was a cold spring of controlled violence. Cheryl Wilson, having taken the shortcut she always promised herself she'd avoid, froze at the mouth of the alley. Her hand, clutching a designer handbag, flew to her lips. The raw savagery of the scene should have sent her running, but she was pinned in place, captivated. It wasn't the fight that held her, but him. Even bruised and cornered, he was devastatingly handsome, like a fallen god forced to walk among mortals. As the last thud crumpled to the grimy pavement, George straightened up, his chest heaving. He ran a hand through his disheveled dark hair, wincing as his knuckles brushed a fresh scrape. That was her cue. Stepping out of the shadows, the click of her heels echoing like a judge's gavel, Cheryl let us slow. A praising smile spread across her face. Well, looks like you could use a hero. George's head snapped towards her, his body tensing again before he took in her appearance, impeccably dressed, entirely out of place, and looking at him not with pity, but with an almost predatory interest. He relaxed slightly, a ghost of a smirk touching his bruised lips. "And I suppose that's you?" he asked, his voice a low, gravelly hum. "It is," she declared, walking closer until she could see the flecks of exhaustion and pain in his dark eyes. "And I don't work for free. Since I've so bravely saved you, you'll have to pay me." She tilted her head, her gaze bold and unwavering. "Give yourself to me. That's the price." A flicker of genuine surprise, quickly masked by amusement, crossed his face. This was new. He studied her for a long moment, the knowing glint in his eyes a secret she couldn't decipher. "All right," he finally agreed, the single word sealing a deal whose terms neither of them truly understood. "It's a deal." The next morning, sunlight streamed into Cheryl's chic, minimalist apartment, a stark contrast to the previous night's grime. George sat on a stool at her kitchen island, wearing a plain t-shirt and sweatpants she'd loaned him. He looked less like a fallen god and more like a stray she'd taken in a dangerously attractive one. Cheryl slid a cup of coffee towards him, her confidence fully restored in her own territory. "So, about your payment," she began, leaning against the counter. "I've decided on the terms. You'll be my personal pet." She savored the word. "You'll live here, do as I say, and be available whenever I need you. For your troubles, I'll give you an allowance, 5,000 a month." She set the number as if bestowing a great fortune, completely oblivious to the fact that it was less than he spent on wine in a week. George simply raised an eyebrow and took a sip of his coffee, the corner of his mouth twitching. "Generous," he said, his tone perfectly neutral. "I know," she beamed, missing the irony entirely. "Now, I have to go deal with some family business. You stay here and recuperate." As she turned to leave, his phone, a simple, unadorned model, buzzed on the counter. He answered it, his back to her. "What is it?" His voice had changed. The playful, downtrodden man was gone, replaced by chilling authority. Blackwood made a move. "Liquidate their holdings in the Asian market, all of them. I don't care about the board. I'll handle them when I get there." He listened for a moment. "Do it." He hung up, the silence in the apartment suddenly heavy. He turned back to her, the easygoing mask slipping perfectly back into place. "Sorry, work call. My boss is a tyrant." Cheryl just shook her head with a sympathetic smile. Poor working drone, she mused, grabbing her keys. Try not to break anything while I'm gone. The door clicked shut behind her, leaving George alone in the quiet hum of her expensive refrigerator, his eyes dark with thoughts of multi-billion-dollar markets and corporate warfare. The drive to her family's villa was filled with a sense of unease that Cheryl couldn't shake. Her father's frantic call had been light on details and heavy on panic. When she pulled into the circular driveway, her unease exploded into full-blown horror. The grand oak doors were wide open. Inside, the home she grew up in was in chaos. Furniture was overturned, vases shattered, and papers were strewn across the marble floor. In the center of the wreckage stood her parents, their faces pale and drawn, surrounded by a group of menacing men in cheap suits. "Every last asset is frozen," one of the men snarled, shoving a sheaf of papers at her father. "The house, the cars, everything. The Wilson Group is a sinking ship, and we're just collecting our due before it hits to bottom. Please, just give us more time," her mother pleaded, tears streaming down her face. "Time's up," the man spat. "What's going on?" Cheryl demanded, her voice shaking as she rushed to her parents' side. Her father looked at her, his eyes hollow with defeat. "It's over, Annie. We're bankrupt. The company, it's all gone. They're seizing the house." The words hit her like a physical blow. Just as the lead creditor was about to retort, a calm voice cut through the tension from the doorway. "I'd appreciate it if you didn't speak to my girlfriend's family that way." Everyone turned. George stood there, hands in the pockets of the simple sweatpants he was still wearing. He looked utterly out of place, yet he commanded the room's attention. He walked past the stunned creditors and stood beside Cheryl, his presence a solid, reassuring anchor. He smiled charmingly at her stunned parents. "I'm George Hoover. It's a pleasure to finally meet you," the lead creditor scoffed. "And who are you, kid? Her broke boyfriend?" George didn't even look at him. His gaze remained on Cheryl's father. "Sir, if you'll permit me." He then turned his head slightly, his eyes landing on the creditor with an unnerving placidity. "Leave now." There was no threat in his voice, only a quiet, final authority that brooked no argument. The man opened his mouth, then closed it, something in George's stare making the hairs on his arms stand up. Muttering under his breath, he and his men shuffled out, their bluster completely deflated. In the stunned silence that followed, with her parents gaping and her own mind reeling, George turned to face Cheryl. His expression was serious, his next words completely derailing what was left of her reality. "Cheryl, marry me." She stared at him, speechless. What are you talking about?" He ignored her confusion and addressed her parents directly, his voice steady and sincere. "I know this is sudden, Mr. and Mrs. Wilson, but I love your daughter. As a betrothal gift, I'd like to offer you $200,000 to handle your immediate difficulties." $200,000. The sum hung in the air. Impossibly large, impossibly wonderful. For her parents, it was a lifeline. For Cheryl, it was a paradox. How could this poor, struggling man she'd planned to keep as a pet possibly have that kind of money? Was he offering his life savings? The sacrifice, the sheer kindness of it, overwhelmed her shock. Her mother began to weep, this time with relief. Her father, his pride shattered but his love for his family intact, could only nod, his eyes misty. Cheryl looked at George, at this enigma who fought like a demon, spoke like a king, and offered salvation like a saint. Flustered, confused, but deeply moved, she heard herself whisper the only word that made sense. "Okay." The iron gates of the Hoover estate parted with a silent, imposing grace, revealing a driveway that snaked through a manicured forest toward a house that looked less like a home and more like a monument to wealth. Cheryl gripped the worn strap of her shoulder bag, her simple cotton dress feeling paper-thin in the shadow of the sprawling marble facade. She was here for a job, a lifeline, caring for the family dog. It felt surreal, like stepping into a different reality where the air itself was priced by the ounce. Inside, the chill of polished stone floors seeped through the sawless of her flats. A stoic butler led her to a sun-drenched conservatory, where an elderly man with kind eyes, Mr. Hoover, sat observing a large golden retriever. The dog, Jack, was a furry ball of mischief, stubbornly refusing to fetch a ball. But when Cheryl knelt, her voice soft and coaxing, Jack's ears perked. Within minutes, he was nudging her hand, tail thumping a happy rhythm against the floor. Mr. Hoover watched, a rare, genuine smile gracing his lips. The salary he offered was more than a lifeline. It was a rescue raft. And for the first time in months, Cheryl felt the crushing weight on her chest lighten. That relief was short-lived. A woman with a face as sharp and cold as the diamonds on her fingers glided into the room. Lisa Hoover, George's stepmother. Her eyes, the color of winter ice, raked over Cheryl's inexpensive dress with undisguised contempt. "And who is this?" Lisa's voice was a venomous whisper that carried across the cavernous room. "This is Cheryl," Mr. Hoover said calmly. "She'd be looking after Jack." Lisa let out a short, incredulous laugh. "Is this some kind of joke? I've seen the way you look at the young master. Do you think we're fools, a girl like you, worming her way in here, thinking you can seduce your way into this family?" Cheryl's blood ran cold. Young master. She thought of George, kind, gentle George, who wore faded jeans and fixed her leaky faucet, who she believed worked a simple 9 to 5. The accusation was so absurd it left her speechless. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Don't play coy with me," Lisa snapped, her voice rising. She gestured to 2 maids hovering nervously nearby. "Make her kneel. She will learn her place." The maids hesitated, their eyes wide with fear, but a single withering glare from Lisa sent them scurrying forward. They took Cheryl's arms, their apologies lost in fright and whispers. Humiliation burned through her as their hands forced her down, her knees hitting the cold, unforgiving marble. It wasn't enough for Lisa. The woman stepped forward, her hand flashing out, and the sharp sting of a slap cracked through the silence, snapping Cheryl's head to the side. Enough. The word was not shouted, but it cut through the tension like a blade. George stood in the doorway, his posture transformed. The easygoing man Cheryl knew was gone, replaced by someone whose presence filled the entire room with an unnerving, absolute authority. His eyes, fixed on Lisa, were glacial. Lisa froze, her hands still raised, her face draining of color as a flicker of genuine fear crossed her features. The maids released Cheryl and scrambled back as if burned. George strode forward, ignoring everyone but the trembling woman on the floor. He knelt, his touch impossibly gentle as he cupped her cheek, turning her face to inspect the red mark blooming there. "Are you hurt?" he asked, his voice low and laced with a quiet fury that was more terrifying than any shout. He rose, turning his gaze on his stepmother and the staff. A silent, lethal warning passed through the room. "From this moment on," he said, his voice dropping to a near whisper, "you will refer to her as Mrs. Hoover. You will show her the respect she is due as my wife. And if any of you ever so much as breathe a word of who I am to her, you will find out what it truly means to be cast out." He helped Cheryl to her feet, his arm a solid, protective barrier around her. "Let's go home," he murmured, leading her away from the wreckage of their silence. Days later, the buzz of Cheryl's phone on the nightstand was an unwelcome intrusion. It was a message from Laurie, her former high school rival, complete with a selfie of her clinking champagne glasses against a glittering city skyline. The text was posed and dripped in honey. "Alumni gathering at the Apex. You should come see how the other half lives, Cheryl, if you can still afford the cab fare." George read the message over her shoulder, his brow furrowed with concern. "It's a setup, Cheryl. You don't have to go. You have nothing to prove to people like that." But Laurie's taunt had found its mark, stirring a defiant pride that had been beaten down, and not extinguished. "I'm not going to hide, George," she said, her jaw tight. "I'm not going to let them think they've won." The apex was a rooftop bar dripping with casual opulence, a place where people came to be seen. The moment Cheryl walked in, she felt 100 pairs of eyes on her. Whispers followed her like a trail of smoke. Laurie, holding court near the bar, greeted her with a smile that was all teeth. "Cheryl, I'm so surprised you came. And where's the hubby?" Still counting his pennies. A wave of cruel, knowing laughter rippled through the group. The mockery was a blunt instrument, crude and painful. But it was the man who detached himself from the crowd who truly terrified her, Austin Hall. His smile was predatory, his eyes lingering on her with a disturbing sense of ownership. He cornered her by a glass partition overlooking the city. "You look surprised to see me," he purred, his cologne cloying and invasive. "You shouldn't be. I've been keeping an eye on you. On your family." He leaned closer, his voice a venomous confession in her ear. "That little bankruptcy problem your father had. A few well-placed calls, a few rumors it was almost easy." Cheryl felt the floor drop out from under her. It wasn't misfortune. It was him. "But I'm a generous man," Austin continued, his hand landing on her arm, his grip surprisingly strong. "Leave your broke husband. Be with me, and I can make all your family's troubles disappear." When she recalled, his face hardened into a mask of rage. He snatched a glass of champagne from a passing tray and, with deliberate, theatrical cruelty, poured the entire contents over her head. The cold, sticky liquid drenched her hair and dress, a public baptism of shame. The crowd gasped, a few people laughing nervously. "Don't be stupid, Cheryl," he hissed, his face inches from hers, his grip tightening on her arm. "I own you now. Your family's future is in my hands." Blinded by tears of fury and despair, she wrenched her arm free and stumbled away from the circle of gawking faces. She burst through a glass door onto a small, private balcony, the wind whipping at her drenched clothes. The city sprawled below, a dizzying tapestry of indifferent lights. She gripped the cold metal railing, her knuckles white. He had taken everything, her family's name, her dignity. Now he was trying to take her, too, below her. The traffic was a distant, silent river. The fall was impossibly far. For a fleeting, desperate moment, the thought of letting go, of simply ending the fight, felt like the only escape left. The shimmering clink of champagne flutes and forced laughter did little to drown out the venom in Austin Hall's voice. He had Cheryl cornered near the edge of the rooftop bar. The city lights a dizzying, indifferent backdrop to her humiliation. His hand clamped down on her wrist, his breath a sour mix of scotch and entitlement. "You think you're better than us now, Cheryl? Married some broke intern. You'll come crawling back." Just as a tear of pure frustration welled in her eye, the ornate glass doors to the terrace burst open, slamming against the stone wall with a resounding crack. The ambient chatter ceased instantly, every head turned. George Hoover stood framed in the doorway. But this was not the gentle, unassuming man Cheryl knew. This was a stranger carved from ice and fury. His tailored suit, which she had always assumed was his one expensive indulgence, seemed to sharpen his form, making him an imposing silhouette against the warm interior light. His eyes, usually soft and crinkling with warmth for her, were glacial chips of steel, and they were locked on the hand gripping his wife's arm. He moved with a silent, predatory grace, the crowd parting before him like the Red Sea. The air grew heavy, thick with a palpable sense of dread. He stopped a foot from Austin, his presence radiating a cold, absolute authority that defied his supposed station. "Which hand?" George's voice was low, devoid of emotion, yet it sliced through the silence with chilling precision. "Touched my wife." Austin, emboldened by alcohol and arrogance, scoffed. Who the hell do you think you? He never finished the sentence. George gave a nearly imperceptible nod to two men who had materialized behind him. A dark suits and stoic expression screaming security. One of them moved with terrifying speed, seizing Austin's offending arm. Before anyone could process what was happening, the man twisted. A sickening crack echoed across the silent rooftop, followed by a guttural scream of agony from Austin as he crumpled to the ground, cradling his now grotesquely angled limb. Panic erupted. Guests scrambled backward, their faces a mixture of horror and awe. In that single, brutal moment, the illusion of George Hoover, the gentle, struggling intern, shattered into a million pieces. Cheryl stared, her heart hammering against her ribs, a maelstrom of fear and a bewildering sense of protection swirling within her. George ignored the chaos he had orchestrated, his gaze softened only when it landed on Cheryl. He stepped forward, his expression shifting from arctic rage to profound tenderness. He gently took her face in his hands, his thumb stroking away the single tear that had escaped. Without a word, he scooped her into his arms, her head finding its natural place in the crook of his neck. He carried her through the stunned crowd, his embrace a fortress, his fierce protectiveness a stark, terrifying contrast to the man she thought she had married. As his men cleared a path to a private elevator, he leaned in, his lips brushing against her ear. His voice was a low, pained murmur. "Why didn't you call me, Cheryl? I told you. You never have to face them alone." His concern was so raw, so possessive, it sent a shiver down her spine. The dots began to connect in her mind: the impossible to get dinner reservations, the sudden resolution of her family's creditor issues, the way doors always seemed open for them. This wasn't luck, it was power, a level of power she couldn't begin to comprehend. The drive back to the Hoover estate was a blur of silence. Once inside the sprawling mansion, that still felt more like a museum than a home, George carried her directly to their suite. He set her down gently on the edge of the king-size bed, his eyes scanning her for any hurt, physical or otherwise. Before either of them could speak, the bedroom door creaked open. Laurie stood there, clad in a silk robe that was clearly not her own, a sly, triumphant smile on her face. She sauntered in as if she owned the place, her eyes fixed solely on George. "There you are," she purred, completely ignoring Cheryl's presence. "I was getting worried. You can't seriously be wasting your time with this charity case." She trailed a finger down George's arm. "Her family is bankrupt, you know. She probably has a line of investors she keeps on the side." Men like Austin always knew her type. Cheryl, who had just stepped out of the ensuite bathroom after splashing water on her face, froze in the doorway. She heard every poisonous word, each one a calculated stab designed to undermine her, to paint her as a promiscuous gold digger. Laurie pressed on, her voice a venomous whisper meant for George alone. "She's not one of us, Georgie. She never will be. Once you're tired of playing house with the gutter rat, you know where to find me." Something inside Cheryl snapped. The shock, the humiliation from the party, the betrayal from the woman she once considered a friend, it all coalesced into a white-hot surge of fury. She launched herself across the room before she even realized she was moving. Her hand connected with Laurie's cheek in a slap so loud it echoed in the cavernous room. "Get out!" Cheryl snarled, her voice trembling with righteous rage. She shoved Laurie hard, sending her stumbling backward. "Get out of my house. Get out of my marriage." Laurie stared, stunned, a red handprint blooming on her face. She looked to George, expecting him to intervene, to put his pathetic little wife back in her place. But George didn't move. He watched the spectacle with a dark, concealed satisfaction. A faint, almost imperceptible smirk touched his lips. He wasn't seeing a distraught victim. He was seeing a lioness protecting her territory. He was seeing his wife, fierce and loyal, and he had never been more proud. Only when Cheryl's breathing grew ragged did he step forward, placing a firm, grounding hand on her back. He turned his cold gaze back to Laurie. "You heard her," he said, his voice dropping back to that lethally calm tone from the rooftop. "Get out." He motioned to the door, where 2 guards now stood sentinel. "And if you ever come near my wife or this estate again, I will make what happened Austin tonight look like a regrettable accident. Now." The guards took Laurie by the arms and forcibly escorted her from the room. Her shocked protests fading down the hall, silence fell, thick and heavy. Cheryl was still shaking, adrenaline and anger coursing through her. She turned to George, her eyes shining with unshed tears and a desperate need for the truth. "George," what she said. He closed the distance between them into strides, pulling her into a fierce, solid embrace. He held her tight, letting her feel the steady beat of his heart. "I don't care what a snake like her says," he murmured into her hair, his voice vibrating with unshakable conviction. "I know who you are. I love who you are. No lie, no one will ever change that." He tilted her chin up, his eyes boring into hers, a silent vow passing between them that sealed their bond against a world of deceit. The ground library of the Hoover mansion was a sanctuary of hushed reverence, smelling of aged leather and lemon oil. Sunlight, thick with dancing dust motes, slanted through the towering Palladian windows, illuminating the intricate patterns of the Persian rug. Cheryl moved with a quiet confidence, her presence a bomb in the cavernous room. She was adjusting the cashmere fur over Jack Hoover's lap when the old man's eyes twinkled, fixing on a high shelf. "Cheryl, my dear," he rasped, his voice a papery rustle. "Could you fetch that leather-bound volume, the Cervantes? My eyes aren't what they used to be, but my memory is." He pointed a trembling finger, and as he shifted his weight in the large wing-back chair, his elbow knocked against a small, ornate pedestal table beside him, time seemed to warp, stretching and slowing as a priceless cobalt blue vase, a family heirloom from the Ming dynasty George had once casually mentioned, wobbled precariously. Jack, startled by the motion, tried to steady himself, but his effort only served to unbalance him further. He lurched sideways, a gasp caught in his throat, his frail body tumbling out of the chair directly in the path of the falling porcelain. A collective shriek echoed from the doorway, where George's stepmother, Patricia, and her daughter, Amelia, stood frozen, their faces masks of theatrical horror. But Cheryl didn't think. She didn't calculate or hesitate. Instinct took over, a primal surge of protectiveness that bypassed all rational thought. She lunged, not for the man or the vase, but for both. In a single, fluid motion of astonishing grace, she threw herself forward, her body a shield. Her left arm shot out, fingers splayed, catching the heavy porcelain artifact an inch from the floor. The impact sent a jarring shock up her arm, but her grip held firm. Simultaneously, she twisted, positioning her body to break Jack's fall. He landed against her side with a soft thud, his weight cushioned by her flesh and bone, his head lolling safely against her shoulder instead of the hard, unforgiving floor. For a stunned second, the only sound in the library was the frantic hammering of Cheryl's own heart. She lay half-sprawled on the rug, cradling a priceless piece of history in one hand, and the patriarch of the Hoover dynasty with the other. The silence was shattered by Jack's sudden, booming laughter. It was a sound full of life and vigor, shaking the dust from the room's stately quiet. He pushed himself up, his old eyes shining with a clarity Cheryl had never seen before. He gripped her arm, not with the frailty of a sick man, but with the firm grasp of a titan. "Did you see that?" he roared, looking directly at the stunned faces of Patricia and Amelia. "Did you see my girl?" He pulled Cheryl to her feet, ignoring her wince of pain from her bruised side. He wrapped his arms around her in a fierce, possessive hug, his cheek pressed against her hair. "This is her," he declared, his voice echoing off the booklined walls. "This is George's wife. My granddaughter-in-law." The world tilted. Cheryl's breath hitched, the words ricocheting inside her skull, refusing to find purchase. George's wife, granddaughter-in-law. She stared past the old man's shoulder, her eyes searching for George, who had just entered from the far side of the library, drawn by the commotion. His expression was unreadable, a mixture of concern and something else, resignation. Patricia's perfectly made-up face went slack with disbelief, her mouth opening and closing like a fish. "Jack, what are you talking about? She's a nobody, a caregiver George hired." Jack released Cheryl only to wave a dismissive hand at his daughter-in-law. "You see nothing because you look for nothing of value. This woman has more character in her little finger than you have in your entire Botox-filled facade." He turned back to Cheryl, his grin impossibly wide. "You saved an old man and a piece of pottery. The Hoover family rewards its own." He snapped his fingers at a stoic man in a suit who had been standing discreetly by the door. "Robert, bring the welcome gift." Robert nodded once, disappearing for a moment before returning with a sleek, silver briefcase. He placed it on a heavy oak desk and clicked open the latches. The lid lifted to reveal stacks upon stacks of crisp, banded $100 bills. Cheryl's mind went blank. She could only stare. "A little something to make you feel at home," Jack said, his tone utterly casual. $5 million. Pocket money, really. Now, listen to me. This is your home now, yours and George's. You will live here, in the master wing. No more arguments." He fixed a glare on Patricia that could have frozen lava. $5 million, pocket money, master wing, George's wife. The phrases swirled in a dizzying vortex in Cheryl's mind. She felt the wave of vertigo, her hand instinctively going to the desk to steady herself. This wasn't George, the kind, handsome driver who struggled to make ends meet. This was George Hoover, heir to this empire, the name on the skyscrapers downtown, the logo on 100 different products she used without a second thought. Every quiet act of protection, every time he'd mysteriously solved an impossible problem for her family, every flash of authority she dismissed as simple confidence, it all crashed down on her at once. He had been playing a part, or rather, he had been hiding the biggest part of himself, as if sensing the collapse of her reality. George crossed the room in a few long strides, his movements filled with the easy power she now understood. He stopped in front of her, his presence a familiar anchor in a suddenly alien sea. He gently took her hand, his thumb stroking over her knuckles. A slow, knowing smirk played on his lips, but his eyes were filled with a deep, unwavering affection. "Surprised," he murmured, his voice low, and for her alone. She could only nod, her throat too tight for words. He didn't need them. His gentle gaze was the only confirmation she needed, the final piece that locked her bewildering new reality into place. Hours later, the chaos had subsided, leaving a glittering, strange new world in its wake. They were alone in their room in the master wing. It was less a bedroom and more a palatial suite, with floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a breathtaking panorama of the city light sprawling like a carpet of fallen stars. The bed was an enormous vessel of white silk and plush pillows, and the air was scented with something subtle and expensive. Cheryl stood by the window, wrapped in a silk robe she'd found in the closet, a closet larger than her old apartment. She was still processing the whiplash of the day, the fall, the revelation, the briefcase of cash that now sat by the door as if it were a bag of groceries. George came up behind her, his arms circling her waist, his chin resting on her shoulder. He said nothing, simply holding her, letting her absorb the view, the silence, the sheer magnitude of it all. Finally, a slow smile touched Cheryl's lips. She turned her head, her cheek brushing against his. "So," she began, her voice a playful whisper. Should I call you Master Hoover now? She felt the rumble of his chuckle against her back. He tightened his embrace, nuzzling her neck. Don't you dare, he murmured, his tone thick with affection. My name is George, it's always been George. That's the man you met, that's the man who fell in love with you. He turned her round to face him, his hands framing her face. His eyes, so often guarded, were wide open, vulnerable. I'm sorry I didn't tell you, Cheryl. I had to know, I had to find someone who saw me. Not the name, not the money. Someone who would dive to save a cranky old man without a thought for the reward. He brushed a stray strand of hair from her forehead. You didn't just save my grandfather today, you saved me the day we met. Tears welled in her eyes, not of sadness or shock, but of profound understanding. It wasn't a lie. It was a test she had passed without ever knowing she was taking it. All the hardship, the humiliation she had endured from people like Amelia, it all seemed so small now, so insignificant. She hadn't needed a prince to rescue her. She had rescued him right back. I was so scared, she confessed, her voice barely audible. Scared for my family, for our future. Our future is here, he said, his voice a vow. And your family will never have to worrying about anything again, I promise. He leaned in and kissed her. A kiss that was both a culmination and the beginning. It was tender and deep, a silent celebration of their incredible, improbable journey. It spoke of rainy nights sharing cheap noodles, of quiet reassurances in the face of her family's struggles, and of a love that had proven itself real long before it was revealed to be rich. As he held her, Cheryl looked over his shoulder, her reflection in the vast window. She saw the same girl, the one with determination in her eyes and a stubborn refusal to give up. But now, she was framed by the glittering lights of a city that was suddenly hers. She was no longer just Cheryl Wilson, an ordinary girl fighting to survive. She was cherished, she was powerful, and she was home. In his arms, under the watchful gaze of a million city lights, their fairy tale had finally found its forever.